there has been such an increase in productivity by workers over the course of the past 60 years, let's say, that if the minimum wage was to have kept pace with productivity, it would be $18, $19 more than it is now, going from like $7.25 to like mid-20s in terms of an hourly wage. So this money has gone somewhere, and it has not gone to workers. And so, and as the productivity increases, right, that creates a certain amount of, theoretically, of slack in the labor market, which then diminishes the power of labor to drive up wages. And so this, by shortening the work week, we're empowering workers both on a wage basis, in addition to all the other benefits that we'll talk about in a minute. But I want to talk about this dynamic of wealth inequality, which has grown exponentially, and how this will impact that.
Yeah, well, precisely. I mean, you've pretty much said it. I think by increasing the per hour wage, by reducing time, you effectively are, you're increasing workers per hour pay. You allow for a tightening of the labor market in favor of workers, effectively increasing a certain scarcity of labor, and therefore forcing employers who have we know they have the cash, we know they have the income to increase employment. For example, I think there's a role to be played by the state, of course, in terms of employment. Public sector employment is huge as well. But yes, effectively, working time reduction is a tool for increasing basically worker voice, allowing a greater control over how much a surplus that employers can draw on, basically. And that's why it's so important. Traditionally, that's why it has been demanded, but particularly tied with productivity gains. This is, new machinery in the workplace. How is that it's going to speed up our life, going to make our work more intense, and so on. And the demand was basically that time should be distributed amongst ourselves. I mean, I think some of the stories which we didn't actually include in the book, for example, early organized labor actions in the US, for example, when it was only the boss who had a timepiece and a watch or a clock or whatever, and basically they would add half an hour on. They'd kind of lie to their workers and say, okay, actually it's still half an hour left, and so on. And so in this one particular town, I forget which one, it's in a book I can recommend, the workers built a giant clock in the middle of the town to say, that's the time. Like, you can't fool us with your fake or kind of dodgy clock. That's the time by which we work. And so I think, it's by controlling that time, by having limits on when we work, it's always been about collective worker power as well as individual choice.
How do you... There's just so many different tiers to how workers get time off in specifically in America. Right now, we're seeing the Kellogg strikers, many of whom said that they were working over 100 days in a row. So, like, the weekend even of itself is a aspiration for a lot of workers in America. A lot of workers just don't have a weekend. So I'm just curious how you approach that particular part of the workforce where a 2-day weekend is already pretty far out of reach in the late stage capitalist way that we're operating here in the United States, for example. And then also, of course, in countries that we exploit in global capitalism on a daily basis.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think it's obviously tragic that people can work 100 days in a row. In the UK, there was a great study by the TUC here on 12% of workers surveyed said they worked 7 days, for example. I think working time it's not, I don't want to reduce the issue of working time simply to a 4-day week demand or to a certain set of workers. I think working time is an issue for literally all workers within a capitalist economy, when time is money and productive time is incredibly valuable. So there was always a disposition, there's always a pressure on workers to keep working, give us your overtime, and so on. So absolutely. I think regulation is basically the way, and the demands from the workforce itself. I also don't want to make the 4-day week to be a silver bullet, basically. I mean, I don't think you could, any demand or any policy is going to sort out labor markets. I do think it can speak to a number of issues, including holiday, maternity leave, sick pay, and so on. Like time away from work is if you look at the list of demands of trade unions throughout history, about 15 or 20 of them are basically to do with working time in some way, holiday, maternity leave, and so on. So I think it's only a good thing, this discussion of radically transforming the way that we work and how long we work for. I think that actually can lift a number of other demands with it. I would say, in contrast to just more holiday, I would say that regular time off is slightly qualitatively different. I think even just on the issue of burnout, I think we all recognize that 2 weeks holiday is great, for example, really like transformative, but then once you're back at work, It's the grind again. Regular time off, as has been shown in some studies, is actually really significant. So I think there is something different about other ways of taking time off and the shorter working week. But I take your point that basically some kinds of workers aren't even at the level where they can restrict their working week to 5 days. They are just worked off their feet.
I would also refute the idea of a 2-week vacation. What is that?
Yeah, sorry, it's much worse in the US than it is.
Yeah,
over here.
a 2-week vacation.
I know.
Well, let's talk. I mean, let's start with that. The experiment in Iceland, because I don't think there is wide awareness of that experiment. What is that? What was the nature of the experiment, and what has it shown?
Yeah, so sorry for being presumptuous. Basically, there was a 5-year trial across 200 different public sector organizations, about 2,000 employees in Iceland. And that's about 1% of the entire workforce. It's a small country. And there were all sorts of different services involved, childcare services, even police stations, but generally administrative work, public administration. And across 5 years, different workplaces reduced their working week without losing any pay by a certain amount of time. So some organizations, it was only an hour, some it was 4 hours. And that doesn't seem much, but it reduced their working week to often around about 35 hours. And that was across a 5-year period. And basically this was tracked and evaluated quite a granular level. And so we managed to publish the results of that. It was kind of done in conjunction with trade unions. And obviously the results might be as you'd expect. Basically, all the workers, even those only taking an hour or 2 hours off a week, thought it was great. Generally, organizational performance was basically as good, if not better than before. More time spent with their families, taking up hobbies and so on, all the things which we'd probably do, which sound a bit cheesy, but I think it's quite heartwarming. And effectively what's happened after that, and this is the best thing, I think, what's happened after the trial, evaluated and so on, was that trade unions then organized new contracts for not just the public sector employees who took on the trial, but also wider private sector as well. So now 86% of the country's workforce now has new contracts, either directly with shorter working hours or with new mechanisms by which they can negotiate shorter working hours in the future. So it's a really significant and great example of there being a trial and then trade unions building on that and establishing a new norm across the country. And that's about 170,000 people of a 200-something thousand workforce. So it's a small absolute number, but quite a high relative number. I mean, imagine if 86% of the US workforce had new shorter working hours contracts.
And we should say, theoretically, when you're talking about smaller enterprises, right, the margin of error is less. You're talking about a smaller country. The margin of error theoretically would be less in terms of what it does for the productivity of that country. I mean, I would imagine in this country, we have a lot more redundancy than you would in there's a lot less redundancy in this enterprise than there is in like a TV show on a cable news place. So I would imagine if there was to be a drop off in productivity, that you would see that. Now, with that said, and maybe this is sort of getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but like, was there value in pitching it in that way? I mean, is this about? Is there value in, or what is the value, I guess I should say, in pitching to the capitalists that like, hey, this is you could see an uptick in productivity. You will have less training of workers because there'll be less burnout. I mean, as opposed to making it a demand in terms of worker power.
Yeah, so I think it's a good question. You're always speaking to slightly different audiences. I think it's what I found in my experience so far is that it's incredibly useful to have precedents established across different aspects of the economy. So different companies moving toward. I don't think we should sniff at companies providing shorter working weeks, decent working conditions for workers in general. And these precedents are incredibly useful because, to some extent, this idea needs to, in its kind of, let's say, the sharp, jagged edges of the future coming through, there needs to be instantiations of this idea. And as much as we don't want to necessarily use simply like decent business standards as examples, it's so up until now we've just been using this one Swedish care home, for example, with the Gothenburg example, where they reduced the working week and so on. Now we have a whole plethora of forms of industry using shorter working hours for the purposes you just mentioned, whether it's productivity increases, staff well-being, and so on. I think my favorite frame is not necessarily to say this is a business strategy, although I think it is. I think the most important thing is that as this idea gets bigger, as it becomes more and more mainstream, and the examples like the Iceland's trial and so on are important. I think it's important that it gets steered in the direction of this is about giving more time to workers without a loss in pay. It's empowering and basically will benefit the vast majority of the population, and businesses can adapt. It's not an impossible idea. And I think the idea of getting rid of the impossibility of it is incredibly important as we move to actually making it a reality. And so for me, as the trade union movement wakes up to this, they have a whole range of arguments and angles to take to each of their employers they're dealing with. And it's not just one which says, we just want this. There's a whole range of things you can talk about, and I think that's basically really powerful. I don't think it's a negative thing, even though it perhaps shouldn't be front and center.